Welcome to a World of Good podcast. I'm Nate Tatman.
And I'm Andrew Gale.
And we are two friends
who love Jesus,
care about the church,
and travel the world to share stories of people who do the same.
Our conversations happen in all kinds of places.
Like a coffee shop and an airport terminal.
Or even the back of a crowded taxi.
But no matter where we go, from Argentina to Zimbabwe,
we capture stories of the good God is doing around the world.
And we hope those stories will do you a world of good. Good morning. Welcome to a World of Good podcast. My name is Andrew Gale. Grateful that you're here with us. Whether you are here in person, we're grateful for those that are here. Give a shout out, those that are here in person. Okay, great. Those that are watching live online or those that are listening later on as we put this on our podcast stream, you can listen to then. So grateful to have all of you listening to this great podcast. We have a great set of guests that are going to join us. I'll introduce them in just a second. But before I do, the surprise that I mentioned earlier is that the person sitting next to me, though tall and handsome as he may be, is not Nate Tatman. And this is a change from what we had planned on having. As you know, Nate and I do a World of Good podcast. We've been doing it for a year and a half now. And Nate is in Baltimore, flying on his way to convention. His flight got canceled. And he was really excited. His flight got canceled, but then he thought, you know what, the good news is I'll be able to join Facebook Live and I can make comments and posts. Nope, the flight they put him on is literally right now. So he is in the air right now. There is no way for him to be at all a part of this podcast. So that is either a really good thing for you or a really bad thing, and I guess we won't know until we get through it. But we have Josh here.
Hello, greetings.
So we're really grateful to have Josh joining us. Some of you may have heard Josh was a part of our podcast this last season and joined us, and so he's been on it before. No stranger to this conversation. And thankfully, somebody that last night when we found out Nate wasn't going to make it, we could sit up in our room and go through the entire podcast together to make sure that we were prepared.
That's right. You can add this to your trailer for the show, you know, in the back of a taxi cab, in a crowded subway, or just completely absent.
Yeah, not there at all, which is apparently what Nate does in this. So thanks, Nate. We will blame you for any bad things that happen today. We're going to blame Nate. So that helps me feel good about where we're going. So first, I want to talk about why we do a podcast. Like, what's the point in doing a podcast? It's not just because everybody's doing a podcast. Don't you realize? It doesn't seem like everybody has started doing a podcast in the last year. Like, COVID happened and everyone's like, oh, I'll tell everybody what's happening in my life via a podcast. Just so you know, we had this idea pre-COVID. This was a pre-COVID podcast. And the original idea is that Nate and I spend a lot of our lives, our ministry, our work, traveling around the world. And we sit with some incredible people that have just the most fascinating stories of the things that are happening, the things that God is doing in their ministry, in their life, in their world. Our faith has been shaped by their stories, and we've come back transformed people and thought, we have a real privilege and an honor to get to do that. And there are people in the church in the United States who either can't or don't have the ability, don't have the time to do that. And so we want to bring those stories to other people so they can be a part of hearing what God's doing around the world. So that was the whole purpose. And then we started, and of course, COVID hit, and you couldn't travel anywhere. So all of the joys of traveling and recording stories stopped very quickly. But we did a lot of it via Zoom for a season. And then this last season, we were able to look at some really specific series and themes that were really great. And so this is our wrap up to season 3. We've done 3 seasons. If you want to hear stories from pastors, leaders, people around the world, some people that are sitting in this room have been interviewed as a part of the podcast, a number of people. So get on, listen, hear about the work that God's doing through the church around the world. Josh was one of those guests that joined us. He joined us this last season when we did our 3 series. We did one on global partnerships, one on millennials and missions, and one on missions and the Black church. And our goal was to take themes that we thought were really prominent in missiology and things that we needed to talk about that needed to be discussed, and to bring in experts in those areas, to bring in practitioners, and then to have a conversation at the end. And so we did a global partnerships one, and Josh Weiger runs our projects at Global Strategy. Right. So we invited him to come in and share some about projects and kind of what does it look like to develop healthy global partnerships. It was great having you.
Yeah, you guys have done a great job of not offering the solution in every situation, but you allow people to tell their life story. And it's really the intersection of our life story and their life story that is the most engaging part of this podcast. So I'm excited for today for that same thing to happen in this live taping of the podcast.
Yeah, it's been a great blessing to me. I'll tell you, it was not my idea. It was Nate's. I was not excited about starting a podcast because it's work and it takes time, but it has been an incredibly, incredibly enriching experience. And the stories that I've heard have continued to shape the way that I see and think about the world. And if you do anything with global ministry at the church that you're a part of, there are some great podcasting to listen to. The Global Partnership series, where we talk with Samir Salibi in Paris, and where we have Alan McDonald, who was a former missions pastor at Fairfax, and then meeting with Josh Weiger, kind of to process all that. Some great conversations across that. And we do one on millennials and missions. It's really fascinating with Allie Hawkins. If you're thinking about how do I engage young people, a great conversation. Just some really good places to start to hear conversations that are going on around missiology. Well, we wanted to try to find a way to wrap this podcast into the convention theme. So the convention theme is to hunger and thirst for justice, for righteousness, for Jesus. And we wanted to explore those themes on an international level. Now, unfortunately, as with everything right now, COVID has made it complicated for people to travel here and be a participant. And so rather than having people live in person, we're doing it via Zoom, which has been our life for the last year. How many people have done everything via Zoom this last year? Yay, we learned how to use virtual everything.
Every hand in the room is up for those who can't see that.
I know, and it's become our world. For us in the missions community, it's been our world for a while, because that's the way we've connected. But it became even more our world in this last year. But we're grateful for these leaders who are going to hopefully bring some international thoughts to the theme that we're going to hear throughout this convention. And the theme verse is Matthew 5:6. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice or for righteousness, for they will be satisfied.
You know, as I was thinking about that verse, even last night, I was thinking about how hunger looks different in different parts of the world. You know, when I say I'm hungry, that means something completely different than my friends on the other part of the world who are food insecure. Yeah. And when they say they're hungry, it means something different. And I wonder for us, even this week at this convention, what hunger really looks like for us. In a spiritual sense, in a community sense, and I'm excited to dive into that theme today, but also the rest of this week at this convention. How many people are going to be here at this convention, Andrew? Do you remember the numbers?
I know it was over 550, but I don't remember what the final number is, and then over 300 virtual. So it's a good amount of people that are engaging in this conversation.
It's been really exciting to just this morning even seeing the flood of people come in. Those who weren't stuck in Baltimore, Nate Tatman, shout out. But to see the excitement, and I think there's so many of us just hungry to be together again. And I see those head nods in this room. So it's just good. It's a good space to be, and what a good way to kick off the week.
Yeah, it's always fun. It feels somewhat like family reunion, getting back and seeing familiar faces, but it feels especially sweet right now, I think, after the year we've had. So we're grateful for that. You know, I talked about this on a podcast in season 2 when we talked about justice. But I want to bring it up here because I just think it's really important. And I was struck by this again this last week. So I was sitting at church on Sunday. Pastor was preaching a great sermon, 2 Corinthians 6, talking about Paul talking to the Corinthians and being a servant and these kind of pieces. And I don't know if you're like me, where you kind of get lost in thought, and then suddenly you have to catch up with pastor and where he is, because you've kind of been. I kind of did that this past. Don't tell my pastor that I did that, but I got a little lost in thought because the word righteousness showed up in 2 Corinthians, and I'm always interested to know what that word is translated from the Greek, but then also in other languages. And so I flipped over to my Spanish Bible, to the NVI, like the New International Version in Spanish. And sure enough, that word is justicia, is justice, because there really isn't a word for righteousness in Spanish. They use the word justice. And I think we do ourselves somewhat of a disservice in English by separating those two words out, because righteousness and justice are incredibly interconnected. Like, when I hear the word righteousness, I think very personal, I think very spiritual. And when I hear justice, I think almost outside of me, communal. But really, those things there is no real distinction. Those things interplay with one another. And so as I read that in Spanish, I was just reminded again as I come to this convention, when Jesus says that we hunger and thirst for righteousness, He's saying we hunger and thirst for justice. It is that same word. And so what does that look like for us? That term justice means 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. And so that's what we're going to wrestle with this week. And we have a chance now to kind of hear some stories about what that might look like in some different areas. And we've invited 3 incredible global leaders to be with us from around the world. I'll introduce each of them when we get to kind of their introduction, but just a really quick introduction. Dorothy Colney here on the bottom left, well, bottom right, I guess left for you if you're looking that way. She is from Myanmar. Reverend Dorothy is from Myanmar and going to be talking about giving us a picture of justice within government and nationalistic crises. What happens in those kind of situations? Then we have the next we're going to meet with Kaitlin Smith. Kaitlin Smith is missionary to Uganda and works in a clinic, and she's going to talk about the global pandemic and things that happened with that, and what does it look like to hunger and thirst for justice within the medical world and working with people when there's a global pandemic. And then Lennox Boyce, Reverend Boyce, is from Barbados and is going to be sharing with us about a recent eruption that happened in the Caribbean and talking about what does it look like during natural disasters to seek justice. And so we're going to hear from kind of 3 different global stories about justice and hopefully give a beautiful picture of what it looks like on an international scale. So for that, we're going to jump in with Reverend Dorothy Colney. So Reverend Dorothy Colney has been leading the Church of God in Myanmar for a number of years. I'm going to ask you, Reverend Dorothy, to give us just some information about the church in Myanmar so we have kind of some context for you. So where are you specifically located in Myanmar? For those that know Myanmar, where are you located?
In Yangon.
In Yangon, okay.
Yangon.
Awesome.
Yangon is the former capital.
Okay.
Capital of Myanmar.
Okay, wonderful. And how long has the Church of God been in Myanmar?
Over 35 years.
Okay, wow. And tell us about the churches there. How many churches are there? Tell us about your church community there in Myanmar.
We have 9 churches. 9 churches in Myanmar and about 2,000 members, including children.
And who are the people who lead those congregations? Are they pastors?
Pastors.
Yeah. How many pastors is that for those 9 churches?
Yes. We have ordained pastors and also licensed pastors. So we have altogether pastors and workers, 22. So those workers and pastors are serving the church.
Wonderful. I got to know Dorothy, Reverend Colney, while I was at Church of the Crossing. You came for a convention, and one of the things that was really fascinating, I just want to share really quickly about Dorothy and that connection with Church of the Crossing is that Church of the Crossing was located at the time. There was a large refugee population from Burma, from Myanmar, that was just a couple miles away. And the church had a real passion for supporting those refugees. They were doing a weekly English class on Saturdays. They had tutors that went in on a daily basis to the school. And then we met Reverend Dorothy and realized, wow, we have a Church of God in that country around the world. And so it was a neat connection for Church of the Crossing to marry some of their local and global ministry in a connection with Reverend Dorothy. And so just for us, it was not something that we were looking for, but something that was like God-given. This conversation, Reverend Dorothy was coming for a Children of Promise meeting. She was put with us to connect, and we had this incredible connection that was made. And we loved getting to know you, Reverend Dorothy, from that experience and cherish that time that we had together. Well, let me talk through the current issue that's going on, and we want to ask some questions about what's been happening in Myanmar. I mean, some of us may have been following stories. One of the challenges is that stories come in and out of our news cycle so quickly. You know, we see it a week and then it's gone because it's no longer at the forefront. But this issue continues to be a challenge in Myanmar. And so we wanted Reverend Dorothy to tell us a little bit about that. So just a really quick context. Last fall, Myanmar held their elections. And towards the start of 2021, so in January, there were questions raised about some of the validity of the elections. In Myanmar, the military and the ruling government are separate, and so the military leaders were demanding answers to these allegations. There were pro-military demonstrations that started happening, and then a few days later, on February 1st, Aung San Suu Kyi, along with President Win Myint and other senior figures from the ruling party, were detained in an early morning raid. Mobile internet and phone services were disrupted in Yangon. And the military declared a state of emergency and said that it would rule for a year. So that's what's happened in February. A lot of us heard that immediate when all of that happened in February. But you guys continue to struggle with this even now today. So can you give us like a really quick update of where you are currently? What's been happening?
So after the junta took power, so pro-military demonstration is continuously happening. And now civil war is starting also. So the junta, they were killing and shooting the demonstrators, more than 900 people after they took power, and including children, pregnant women, and also many old people. And also the church is, during this time, we have a very hard time. Last year, the whole year was COVID. Because of the COVID-19, we were locked down. And this year, because of the military, the junta is taking power, and we have another lockdown, so double lockdown. And also, they are very, very rude and brutal and merciless, killing every day. So that was a very hard for us, but sad thing. We can see many people in front of us, shooting and dying on the streets, and many bloodshed, and so terrible to see it.
Reverend Dorothy, I'm really curious. This picture is shocking to us as we listen to this, and even as we watch the news, the pictures were incredibly shocking. But what does the church look like? How does the church respond? What does the church look like during an event like this?
Yes, last year, because of COVID-19, we were locked down and we cannot meet together in the church. It was not permitted. And this year, the junta also not permitted to have worship service in our church. So all the church closed. But our church, our members, we encourage them to have worship service on Sunday in their home, and they can have family worship service. And I am staying in the church compound. So in my church compound is there's about 20 people staying also, so we can have worship service in the church. So
yeah, so I was just gonna say, you have 20 people that are living in that church compound so that you can have worship services on Sunday together, because you wouldn't be permitted otherwise to come together. Is that right?
yes, from outside people, they cannot come. But only the people within the compound can have.
Are you able to get outside of your housing complex, outside of the church complex, to walk around? Are people able to go to work? Like what is the constraints on the everyday living?
We can go out, but everywhere there are shooting and killing. Even in our opposite is the Singapore embassy, and the policemen were guarding those embassy. And then in nearby our church, there's a high school, and police are occupied in those school. So we are not free to go outside, but we can go, but not oftenly. It is not good to go because everywhere, excuse me, everywhere shooting and bomb are exploring everywhere. And when will it happen? We don't know. So it is safe to stay at home.
You mentioned when we chatted earlier this week, and I know you're being cautious what to say because you want to be you don't want to be too shocking, but one of the things you shared is that as people are being killed, when the bodies are returned to their families, that they're sewn up. Can you just give a brief explanation of that, not getting too graphic, but helping us understand how just absolutely brutal this really is.
So they were shooting the demonstrators while on the street, and they took the bodies and they sent the body back, but the body was, open and sewed, and they took all the organs, and we heard that these were sold to China.
I think that's shocking, not just in like the brutality of it, but also in the one of the words that I've heard often. I was in Honduras recently and visited with a pastor there, and the word that he used over and over with death in this season, and I think it connects to this, is a lack of dignity. That people aren't able to die with dignity right now because of fears and because of COVID. But I think the same is true here in Myanmar. Like there's a lack of dignity in that kind of a way of interacting. What's the church's response? Oh, go ahead, Reverend Dorothy. I'm sorry.
Those people, demonstrators, are dedicated their self for the country and to free from the junta. That's why they are very brave and they are ready to die. And some of the young people, they went into the ethnic army groups, took some trainings and came back. So they don't afraid to die because they are dying is like a martyr, for the country.
You've said that a lot of these are the younger people. It's the Gen Z, I think, is the word that you use to describe them. Is that true? A lot of the protesters?
Generation Z.
Yeah. So what's the church's response in this? How do you respond in this kind of a crisis?
We cannot do very much going out and doing evangelism or something, but we are more praying for them, for the country, and for the people who are demonstrating, because they are really dedicated. Even the mothers, the parents are not allowed to go and have demonstration, after they were shooting. But the young children, these Generation Z, they said that who will do if we are not sacrifice and do this, because we have been slaves under these military for more than 70 years. So now we want to be free, and we want our country to be democracy, and we have the federal, country. So that's why they are very willingly to give their lives. And it was, to see very sad, they are dying on the street, but their dying is really precious to us.
Yes. Yeah.
And one thing I learned from their dedication, before, when we are telling the gospel and dying Jesus on the cross and shedding his blood, it is very difficult, to them to make understand about this kind of Jesus shedding blood and dying on the cross for us. But now it is, the way they are dying on the street and giving their lives for the country. It is now, I think, after that we can have the gospel to tell them easily now that how they sacrifice for the country and shedding their blood. So the same Jesus Christ loved us and, shed. I think we can tell them, and they can understand more easily.
The real life parable of Jesus' sacrifice for us, for sure.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm thinking back, hungering and thirsting for righteousness and justice. It leads us to something. And your story is the real life example of hungering and thirsting for justice in a national sense in your country. Reverend Dorothy, thank you for your vulnerability in the story and sharing with us about so much. Our hearts are with you. For sure, we have lots of ways we can pray with you and for you, but we'd love to know specifically, what are the ways you would ask us to pray, and how can we walk with you in that way?
Please pray for our country to be free from the junta, because we have been under them more than 70 years, and they are killing their own people. And they are greedy, and they want for their position. And they are using the military to protect themselves only, not the people of the country. So the injustice is, we need justice. The main thing is we need justice and we need freedom.
Thank you, Reverend Dorothy, for that story. We will be praying with you, and we're going to spend time in prayer at the very end of this for each of these people and each of their situations. Reverend Dorothy may be with us. It's like 11 o'clock at night in Myanmar because we're so far on the West Coast, and so if she falls asleep at the table, we're going to give her grace in that as well. But we will be praying for you nonetheless. She says she's a night owl. She's up until midnight. So hopefully she'll be with us until the end. We can pray for her. But
I'm okay. I'm okay with that.
Thank you, Reverend Dorothy. The next story we want to hear from is from Kaitlin Smith. Kaitlin is a global strategy missionary working in Uganda. Her primary role is supporting 5 clinics that the Church of God in Uganda run. The clinics in Uganda are striving to build a team of Ugandan nurses, doctors, and other administrative personnel whose purpose is to expand the programs and services the clinic can provide while working towards self-sustainability. They do this through partnerships with local government entities, non-governmental organizations, and other churches and organizations that support medical missions. In addition, they work to integrate discipleship into the ministry of the clinic so that every patient will have an opportunity to learn about Jesus, commit their lives to Him, and follow Him. So Kaitlin, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us this morning where we are. I think it's still morning where you are too, or close to it. Yeah.
Just
a little
barely.
bit. So how long have you been serving in Uganda?
I have been in Uganda now since January of 2019, so 2.5 years. It goes by quick.
That's awesome. Give us, so the clinics that you work with, that you're a part of supporting, give us a picture of what they're like, because there's a vast array of pictures in my mind of what clinics are like. And my guess is that it doesn't look much like a hospital that I would visit here in the States, but can you give us a picture of what the clinics look like there in Uganda?
Yeah. So we have 2 smaller clinics and 3 bigger ones. The smaller ones would be the equivalent of like an outpatient facility. You come, get your medications, you go home, with the exception that they also do labor and delivery services. And then the other 3 clinics, in addition to those services, also can admit patients overnight and have a male ward, female ward, and pediatric ward.
Wow, that's awesome. So this past year, or maybe even the last 18 months, have been filled with conversations around COVID-19. If we're not tired of it yet, we have to be pretty close, because that's been the conversation of everything that we've experienced, right?
Yes,
and the challenge of this is that it's a global pandemic, right? So though I don't want to deny the suffering that people in the United States have experienced, because certainly it's been very tragic here. The little travel I've done to Honduras and then the stories I've heard from around the world, I just think the suffering is even exponentially greater outside the United States for all kinds of different reasons, disparity. And so I can't even begin to think about what Uganda looks like during COVID-19. So what has COVID been like in Uganda? Can you give us a picture of that experience? Because I know what it's been like for me, but it's mostly just being stuck at home. I say stuck. That sounds so negative. My wife's going to be so disappointed I use the word stuck at home. I should say I loved being home all the time. The ability to stay home all the time. Lots of bread making, right? These are the jokes that we make. Because really, it's just been it's been a
shift.
Yes. But tell us what it's like in Uganda. What has COVID been like? And maybe even an update where they are even today.
Sure. Yeah. So, first, you just have to have some context for what healthcare is like in Uganda. A study came out just before the pandemic assessing the intensive care unit capacity at hospitals. And that a study showed that the entire country of Uganda had only 55 intensive care unit beds, meaning a ventilator and oxygen, for its entire population of 42 million people.
55 beds, not 55
units.
Yeah, 55 beds.
Yeah, exactly. For 42 million people. And then, even the amount of doctors that we have in the US, we have approximately one doctor for every 450 people, whereas in Uganda, they have approximately one doctor for every 24,000 people. So, our healthcare system is already overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So flattening the curve for us, we were already at max capacity, especially on the intensive care unit side. And really, when you look at the amount of cases Uganda's had comparative to the rest of the world, in the beginning, we were, really spared, which was a blessing given what the medical situation is there. So the first year, I'll say, of the pandemic, March till this March, the biggest issue was when we were in lockdown, which was about 3 or 4 months that we were in strict lockdown. There was no public or private vehicles allowed. So the only way people could get around was by walking or by bicycle. And all businesses were closed, which that's a really big problem for the people in Uganda because most are casual day laborers. The amount of money that they make in a day is what they use to buy food for that day. So if they're not able to work, they're not able to feed their families. If a child gets sick with malaria, they're not able to buy medicines. So that was extremely hard for the people of Uganda during the lockdown. People were shouting in the streets, better we die of coronavirus than starve to death. And, people were coming to my gate every day and begging for food. So that was really challenging. Once the lockdown lifted, things were really good. And Uganda got back to normal relatively quickly. But we've had some developments just since May. I think we have gotten one of the more contagious strands, and cases are really ramping up over the last 2 months. So if you look at the numbers, the entire amount of cases we had from the entire pandemic has now doubled just in the last 2 months.
Wow. And here for us in the States, and I think you've been in the States actually for a couple weeks, Kaitlin, and so you've experienced, the different world that's here right now in the pandemic world, how it's different here. And a large part of that is because of the vaccines. What's the vaccine rollout been like in Uganda, and has that helped at all?
Yeah, so the Uganda Ministry of Health is saying that they have 2% of the population vaccinated. They got their first vaccines in March, which was the AstraZeneca vaccine, and they ran out of those. And I heard that just on Monday, they got some more vaccines, but it's really hard for these countries to be able to afford the vaccinations like the US and other larger countries can.
And then the rollout, I'm sure, has all kinds of complications, and then with some of these shots, getting the second shot to get fully covered.
Yeah. That's I was looking at the specific numbers of what they were saying for the 2% even. So I'm not remembering the numbers exactly, but the amount of people that had gotten the first dose was like, several 100,000, whereas the amount of people who had completed the second dose was only like 50,000. Wow. So now they're out of the vaccine. So what do you do? If you got the first dose, then you can't get the second dose. So yeah.
So for you, working in the medical field, what has it been like for you working in Uganda during COVID and for your clinics?
Yeah. Well, when we, like I said, the cases weren't very many in the beginning. So we had multiple suspected cases of COVID, and we would call the government. They would come in and they're like hazmat suits and, test the patient. But we had not had any cases up until, like I said, this May. Now we've started getting cases, but, the higher level of care is so limited. Even our facilities, we only have one clinic that has oxygen services available. So all that we can do for the places where they don't have oxygen is, give steroids, antibiotics if need be. And there's been some more recent studies that have come out about some antiviral drugs that are beneficial. So really just supportive care.
I've heard you share some stories of things that happened to you while you were in lockdown and during COVID. And I just they were really powerful stories. So can you tell us some stories that have come out of your time in Uganda during COVID that you'd be willing to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give you another background too, one of the restrictions during the lockdown was the government was distributing some food, but unfortunately, they didn't have the logistics to be able to hand out massive amounts of food on a countrywide scale. But the really shocking part was that the government made anyone other than them found to be distributing food illegal. And if you were found to be distributing food, you would be arrested for attempted murder. The reason given for that being that groups would gather to get the food and spread the virus. So spoiler alert, I don't know if Church of God knows, but we did some food distribution. And so I have lots of cases of attempted murder counts. So you have an attempted murderer in your midst, guys. So we ended up being able to give out almost 8,000 pounds of food to more than 350 families. And through that process, we had 81 people accept Christ. And there's two specific stories that my staff shared with me as they were going home to home, distributing food, praying with people, encouraging them. And the first story they shared with me was of two women who were stuck in prostitution. And they had become completely destitute during that time, because if you can't afford to buy food, then you cannot afford these ladies' services. And then they had, become ashamed of the life that they had been living and depressed and kind of reflecting on where their life had taken them. So when my driver got to their house, the women didn't even really want to come out of the house just because they were depressed and ashamed. But my driver went in to give these women food. And one of the women just started sobbing. She said, "I cannot believe, after everything that I have done in my life, that there is a God who would still love me enough to send me food. Out of everyone who is in need right now, that he would choose me, that he would choose to send people to my home. So for me, from this day forward, I am going to leave my past life behind, and I am going to serve the God who loves me and sees me."
It's beautiful. Wow.
Yeah. The other story they told me was of a Muslim woman, and she had become sick during the lockdown. And if you can't afford to buy food, then you definitely can't afford to buy medicine. And if you're forced between the choice of buying food and buying medicine, you'll buy food first every time. So she had become weak from her illness, and then the family had run out of food. So she became even weaker to the point where when my staff showed up at her house, she couldn't even get up off the mattress that was laying on the ground. And my staff were able to give her food and to pray with her. And a week later, who shows up walking to our gate but this lady? She wanted to come and thank my staff for the food that they had given. And this is what she told them. She said, "I am a Muslim woman, and I had been praying to Allah to come and help me. But who shows up at my doorstep but the Christians?" So for me, from this day forward, I am going to serve the God who hears me and answers my prayers. And she accepted Christ right then and started fellowshipping from our church, and still fellowships with us to this day.
Wow. I love it. I love it. Justice, I was thinking about it this morning. Justice is such a relational term. It's such a relational term. People living in right relationship with God, with one another, and with natural creation. And I think we just like bore witness to the story of justice playing out. God's justice playing out through food distribution and through relationship with these women. It's beautiful, Kaitlin. It's beautiful. And I'm sure, because I've been to Uganda and I've heard you share some of these stories, it comes from such a genuine love that your staff had for the people. They didn't have to do that. You weren't ordering them to do that. You were. This wasn't part of their job description. In fact, it was attempted murder. I mean, you just told us that. Can you just tell us about the impetus? Like, what is the heart behind that for your workers?
Oh, they were so honored to be a part of it, to help their people. And just so grateful for all the people back in the States who would give to people who are not their own people, saying, they know that there's hurt going on in the US, so that people from across the world would love them enough to, not only help their own people, but help people that they've never met halfway around the world. They were just blown away by that and felt like it was such an honor and a privilege to be able to be a part of helping the community there.
That's awesome. Well, this is our first Facebook Live, and as far as I know, the first attempted murderer we've had. So that's great. I like first. Kaitlin, how can we be praying specifically for you, for the work that you do at the clinics, for your staff, for the country of Uganda? What are some things that we can be lifting up really specifically in these days and months to come?
Yeah, I mean, definitely with the pandemic, I think our greatest hope would be getting some people vaccinated and, just preventing the cases that are currently there, and kind of getting the transmission rate under control. So just the health of the people there. And they've entered into another lockdown, but at least businesses are able to be open at this time, so people can still work and gain some source of income. So just keeping them in mind as they're going through a surge in cases. In addition to that, we're always trying to grow and expand our ministries. And so praying that we get donors to provide things like oxygen concentrators and other essential equipment that is needed. And then in addition, as I look into my next term of ministry, we're really focusing on the local administrative piece. So I'm going to be looking to find some local Ugandan nationals who are gifted in healthcare administration, so that pray that God would bring the right people that can grow and expand and really take on this ministry.
That's awesome, Kaitlin. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
We have one more guest we want to introduce you to for this podcast, and that's Reverend Lennox Boyce. Reverend Boyce is pastor, leader in the Caribbean, and from Barbados. So, Lennox, tell us about the Church of God specifically first of all, welcome. It's so good to see you. I should say welcome first.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Josh.
Tell us a little bit about the church in Barbados. Give us a picture of the Church of God there.
Okay, well, the Church of God in Barbados began in 1912, so we are now 109 years on the island of Barbados.
Wow.
It really began with a missionary from the United States who was a Barbadian. His name was Philip Scanterbury, and he started some open-air services in Myanmar Quarter in St. Peter, and the Church of God spread across the island. I think we have about 8 churches who have been here for more than 100 years,
Wow.
Church of God congregations. And most of the others would have been here for in excess of 65 years. So we've been here for a long time on the island of Barbados. For the most part of our history, I think we had about 20 congregations. We had a high, I think, of 24. But right now we have 18 congregations. The Church of God in Barbados is led by the Reverend Vasco Perry, who is the chairman of our assembly. And we minister to about 2,000 persons.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So for those that are unfamiliar, again, I have admitted very openly on the podcast that I'm terrible about this, but knowing where places are. So Barbados, like when I think of Barbados, I just have like a fuzzy picture of the Caribbean, but I could not probably pinpoint it on a map. So give us like a sketch of where you are in the Caribbean so that we can have a better context for your location.
No problem. Now, anytime you look at a map of the Caribbean and you see the island chain,
Okay.
Barbados sticks out in the Atlantic Ocean.
Okay.
More easterly than all the other islands in the Caribbean chain.
Okay.
Once you see that, that's Barbados. But we are a Caribbean island. The islands in the Atlantic would be persons like Bermuda, Cayman Islands, Curacao, and so on. But we are very much in the Caribbean and in the Caribbean Atlantic region on a whole. But yeah, Barbados is more easterly than the other islands in the chain. And small island, 166 square miles, but a place where the Church of God is alive and well, and lots of lovely people reside.
Andrew, you're my boss. If you have any trouble knowing where Barbados, you could send me, and I could take lots of pictures for you.
Yeah,
and
thanks for that.
I'm sure we need to get someone there. So I'm
Yeah.
volunteering.
And then you'll probably plan to stay. He'll need somebody to fill your role at
He's going to want to be a
strategy.
missionary to Barbados. He's going to move his whole family there. Yeah. You told me that like the average temperature when we talked this past week, it was chilly where we were, but it was very nice where you are. What's the weather like?
We have summer weather all year long.
Sounds
Summer
difficult.
weather and beautiful beaches. so it's really the place to be. As most of the Caribbean islands have, the lovely beaches, lovely weather. Just at this time of the year, it gets a bit rainy because this is heading into what we call the hurricane season, beginning June, July, and heading right down to about November. It gets a bit rainy in spots, but wonderful weather right through.
Is there like a competition between Caribbean islands of who has the best beaches? And if there is, does Barbados have the best beaches?
I don't think that's a good question to ask me, Andrew.
A little biased, maybe.
Because of my responsibility for the Caribbean Atlantic region.
That's right.
I have to be very careful what I
That's
say.
right. You have to be
So
non-biased.
I want to reserve the right not to answer that question.
You're welcome
in
to.
part, but to say that yes, there is some competition between the islands or among the islands about who has the best beaches. And I wouldn't say, I have an opinion on it, but I wouldn't say who I think do have the best beaches.
Yeah.
But
it's
debatable.
I won't put you on the spot with that. I grew up in Kansas and now live in Indiana, and I am
You
close
have the
to
best beaches?
no beaches. So any of your beaches would be better than my current situation.
That's great. In April, there was a volcanic eruption on the island of St. Vincent, which is a close neighbor to you in Barbados, and we reached out to you immediately to find out what was going on. Can you tell us about that eruption on that small island and what happened and what the current state is?
Okay. Well, April 9th, to be exact, the La Soufrière volcano on the island of St. Vincent erupted, causing panic across St. Vincent for sure. Lots of devastation. And persons in places like Barbados, where I live, and Grenada, and so on, felt some of what they were going through, but not to the same degree. The previous last eruption of that volcano was in 1978, which means that it has been 43 years or so since the last eruption.
Okay.
And so persons were in denial, even though the signs were there. Persons, obviously, it hadn't erupted in their generation.
Yeah.
And so even though all the precautions were being taken, the warnings were being given by the government, it still took some persons by surprise. The eruption was significant because Barbados is 105 miles away from St. Vincent. But we had ash fall here, so significant that roofs collapsed under the weight of the ash. Persons had major work to do around their homes because of the ash fall. Some was also felt in Grenada as well. And obviously, in St. Vincent, there was widespread destruction because of the lava flow from the volcano, because of the eruptions and so on. So it was a miserable, difficult time for the people in St. Vincent. The government had to evacuate 22,000 persons who lived in close proximity of the volcano. The population of St. Vincent is about 110,000 persons, so it's about 1/5 of the population that had to be evacuated. Many of these persons are presently still in shelters provided by the government. So some schools, community centers, and so on are being used as shelters.
Do we have?
We have.
I was going to say, do we
Yeah,
have churches
go ahead.
on St. Vincent, and tell us about how they were affected?
Sure. We have two churches in St. Vincent, one in Park Hill, that's closer to the volcano, and one in Fair Hall. Our work there is right now being coordinated by Sister Maureen Kennedy, who also works with me. She is the president of the regional women. So she is president of the Caribbean Atlantic Women. And she helps to coordinate the work in St. Vincent. She's been doing lots of work there. The church in Fair Hall, what some members were able to do is that they were able to adopt families. So there were families from Park Hill who were adopted by families in Fair Hall and are presently still with them. So they support those families in that way. The church in Fair Hall also takes food, clothing, toiletries to the shelters where they minister to persons from Park Hill who are in shelters as well as other persons from communities around the Fair Hall area. So they've been doing quite a bit of work ministering to the needs of persons who were severely affected by this volcanic eruption.
I cannot help, and I have to say it because I was thinking it even when Reverend Dorothy was talking, how the church was being sanctuary. Imagine the church actually not just having a sanctuary, but being a sanctuary. Yeah. And what a beautiful picture, Reverend Boyce, of that playing out in the Caribbean islands. I can't help but think too, we are in hurricane season, and natural disasters are common in the Caribbean, but it's what has that been like for you all? I with global conditions changing, do you see those growing in intensity, seeing more storms? What's your experience with natural disasters currently?
Yeah, it's been a concern for us for many years. We've seen hurricanes become stronger. We have seen them become more frequent in the Caribbean area. And it's something that is an ongoing concern for us, especially during the summer months heading into the latter part of the year, when we have more systems passing through this area, coming off the African coast. Last year, we had a very severe hurricane, which devastated the Abaco Island in Bahamas. Prior to that, we would have had Irma and Harvey. Those were two hurricanes that passed through in 2019 and destroyed the church in St. Thomas Virgin Islands. And those folk there lost their church, and they're still worshiping under a tent right now. We've had devastation in most parts of the Caribbean. Not every year. We've had major hurricanes affecting us, but once it's too often. And so we know that this is something that we have to be very mindful of. And it's something that as a church, we have to be ready to respond to.
Yeah, you said that they name hurricanes through the alphabet, and the last couple of years they've been going back to the start of the alphabet because they've run out of names. Yeah. Yes.
And so that shows the frequency of these systems.
Absolutely.
So once it becomes a storm, an official storm, and not maybe something like a tropical disturbance or depression, once it becomes a storm, it gets a name. And so once these systems are named, they've exhausted in the last 2 years all the letters of the alphabet and had to restart because of the numerous systems that would have passed through, which would have reached storm or hurricane strength. Yeah, so it's been a tough season, tough few years, decade for us in the Caribbean dealing with these natural disasters.
That have not just immediate effect, but really the devastation carries long term for your churches. I mean, I think you have a church in St. Thomas that's still meeting in a tent building since 2019 when the church was destroyed.
Yes.
With the church suffering so much from disasters, how do you balance the work of the church and the ongoing situation with natural disasters? Like, how do those go hand in hand?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Josh. And what we do is help our members to understand that helping the needy, reaching out to the poor, ministering to persons who are afflicted is the mission of the church. So we don't see it as two separate things that we are doing, one being spiritual and one being secular, one being sacred and one being secular. But we see all of it as the work of the church.
Amen.
I remember hearing Jim Lyon say some time ago that he is passionate about helping the 21st century church to become more like the first century church. And I found that so interesting, because the first century church, they were spiritual, yes, but you would realize that what they did was that they met needs.
Yes.
Persons had all things in common because they cared and they shared and they helped. And so it's important that we see all of this as part of the mission of the church. It's not just something that is added on to what we are called to do. Yeah. It is what we are called to do. And so we've been, churches across the Caribbean have been reaching out. We've had persons in various territories who have been reaching out to St. Vincent, sending finances, sending toiletries and clothing and awesome. Food items were being shipped into St. Vincent. And we saw this as part of our responsibility as a Caribbean Atlantic church to ensure that we are extending a hand and we are reaching out to them and seeking to help. So we see all of this as part of our mission and not something that is separate from what we are called to do.
I think that's beautiful. And I think we see that in all three of these stories, you know, that call for the church to be present, to be connected to what's going on. I mean, Dorothy, when we were talking this past week, I remember thinking that the way you're describing 20 people living in a church compound so that you can worship together, to me sounds like the first century church. You know, I think that sounds like what you're describing, you know, Brother Lennox as well, that the first century church was a unique place where spiritual and physical needs were met. And I love that you guys are finding a way to do that and to connecting across the region to make that happen, connecting across islands that are all dealing with this, supporting one another, extending that hand of fellowship and support. I just think that's a really beautiful thing,
Thank you.
As we go to a time of prayer, how can we be praying for you, for the church in Barbados, for the church in St. Vincent, for the church across the Caribbean as you minister and connect with people who are so affected by these kinds of natural disasters?
Well, Andrew, I know that persons have heard about our natural disasters, how prone we are to natural disasters, but I think that we have an even greater concern in the Caribbean Atlantic region. And I think that our major concern is leadership. We've had a set of leaders who have led our churches right across the Caribbean Atlantic region, some in excess of 30 years. These are persons who were trained at our Bible school in Trinidad and who took up pastorates and who poured their lives into the church for sometimes in excess of 30 years, 40 years. And many of them have recently retired or on the brink of retirement. And we don't have persons who are called to the ministry who are ready and willing to step up and to fulfill these leadership roles in our churches. And I think that to me is our greatest need. So if you're going to pray for the Caribbean, please pray for the development of strong godly leaders who will lead our churches in the region as we head into the rest of this century and beyond. I think that to me is our greatest need for prayer right now.
Thank you so much, Reverend Boyce, and thank you all of you for being a part of this conversation. Thanks for giving us a picture into your world, the good, the bad, the beautiful, the challenging. So many times those things go hand in hand, the beautiful and the challenging. And so we're grateful that you would give us the opportunity to enter into those conversations and we hold those as sacred moments for us to be a part of that. And yeah, thank you so much. At this time, we're gonna.
Can we have the audience here, since we have a live audience today on this podcast recording? Would you all mind thanking our guests this morning with just an
Absolutely.
applause?
Thank you. Thanks for listening to A World of Good. A World of Good is a podcast production of Global Strategy and Church of God Ministries. Our theme song is Colorado by Leo Flores. If you want to join the conversation, visit us at Twitter at A World of Good Pod, on Instagram, A World of Good Podcast, or visit our website, chogglobal.org/A World of Good. And join us next time as we share more stories of good from around the world.